Okay, welcome to the coveted Friday afternoon on the last day of the conference time slot. I know 3 days of SREcon is a lot to absorb. You've also had a lot of lunch that you're trying to absorb, so I'll hopefully be able to keep you engaged and interested for this talk, but I thank you very much for coming. So I'm going to be talking to you today about preparing SRE teams for responding to novel failures. Just very quickly about myself. So on the opening keynote, when they asked, what roles do you identify with, I put up my hands for developer, manager, and SRE, and I do those various ambiguous roles at Shopify. Shopify is a commerce company. I'm just going to tell you a couple of quick points that are relevant to the talk. So today, Shopify has roughly 120 people in an SRE-like role. But about 5 years ago, when the SRE group was formed, it was about 30 people. So most of the information I'm giving you in this talk, I think, are applicable to companies that are in that kind of range. And if you're significantly smaller or significantly larger, your mileage may vary with how applicable the experience is to you. And just to give you a feel for what failure means and what incidents mean at Shopify, so our platform processes $1,700 USD per second in merchant transactions, which means that every second our platform is down, our customers are losing $1,700 a second. So it's something we take very seriously, and we put a lot of thought into how do we prepare for these and how do we get really good at responding to incidents at a large scale. So the three things I want to cover today, I want to start with just a really quick motivation for why I think it's really important to think about preparing your teams for failures before they happen. I think hopefully a lot of it will be obvious to you. And then the bulk of my talk, I'm going to go through a bit of a survey. My idea with this talk was rather than go deep into one thing, I wanted to kind of give you a landscape view of the different techniques that teams use for responding to, for preparing for failures, preparing for incidents, and give you some color commentary on how we've adopted these ideas at Shopify and how well they've worked for us or not, to give you some feedback on whether these might be useful for you. Of course, every company is different, right? So this is really just our survey of how it works for us, and hopefully it's useful for you. Last section of the talk, I want to get a little bit deeper into truly novel failures, so the kind of failures where by definition, you cannot specifically prepare for them because they're the kind of failure you've never had before. How do you prepare for those? So that sounds like an impossible thing, but I have some ideas on how to do that too. So I'm going to give you two claims to motivate why it's really important to be thinking about incident preparation. So the first one is that, my first claim is that if you are an SRE team that is successful, what you will tend to see is that you will have a continual trend or pressure towards a higher failure rate or a higher novelty rate in your failures. And the reason for this is fairly simple. If you are experiencing the same kind of failures over and over, SRE best practices say what you should be doing is analyzing those failures, learning from them, building more resiliency into your system so that next time that kind of failure occurs, your system is resilient to it. So if you were successful at this, if you were taking the predictable failures and turning them into non-incidents for you, then what emerges as incidents after you've been doing this for a while is only the novel failures, the failures that you haven't seen before. So you'll see this continual trend towards novelty in your failure situations. Second, hopefully not too controversial claim, engineers, people who go into software development and computer science and engineering tend to be the kind of people who like structure, orderly, predictable. The bread and butter of our profession is largely building up very systematic solutions to problems, and incidents are not like that, right? As many of you I'm sure know, incidents are very chaotic. They require a lot of creativity. They require a very unique, very different kind of practice or a different kind of approach than you often experience in an engineering world. So this is something that's novel and scary for a lot of engineers, and practice at this really helps to take some of that difficulty away and make it a little bit more comfortable to deal with. But again, so how do we practice for things that are inherently unpredictable? So I'm going to go through 5 different practices that we've used at Shopify and give you some feedback on how well they work for us. So the first one is might sound a little bit odd. The idea here is that we have a very strong practice of our incident responses must be happening entirely in the open internally in the company, which means that all of the discussion and decision-making and data behind those decisions is available in real time to people within the company who want to access it, so they can shadow that incident and they can learn from it in real time. So the anti-pattern we're trying to avoid here that you might see in some companies is incident response is a conference bridge with only the most seasoned, experienced engineers in the company, and others in the company who don't get access to that learning that is going on in those incidents, and it's hard to sort of break into that circle of experts when they're happening in a really closed world. So we try very hard to have our incidents happening very much in the open, so that engineers who need to, or if you're going to be going on call in the future, you can shadow active incidents and you can learn from them. And this has been a really powerful technique for us for helping sort of level up the whole company's ability to respond to incidents as we scale up. Second technique is one you should know well if you've read the SRE textbook, incident simulations, also known as Wheel of Misfortune. So the idea here is that you have one or more people who are taking on the role of an incident responder, and then you have a game master or proctor who is taking on the role of the system and sort of playing through a role-playing simulation of step-by-step responding to a failure and the follow-up to it. So there's a lot more written and said about this elsewhere, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. We've actually found incident simulations have not been a huge tool for us. The big drawback that we've found with them for ourselves is that they're only as good as existing human understanding of system behavior. And what I mean by that is, if you create a simulation based on historic failures, well, likely we have built additional mitigations and strategies into the system where our response to that failure is going to be different this time. So taking that historical information might actually cause us to make incorrect decisions in a future incident. And if you create a simulation where you're making up a new scenario, well, that's, when playing through that is only going to be as good as some human's understanding of how the system will respond to that. So we found them to be a little bit limited effectiveness for ourselves. I know they're very effective elsewhere, so it's worth trying. One situation we find them really useful is for training new team members. So if you have a very experienced team, a new person comes in, incident simulations are a great way to ramp up a new person because you're transferring knowledge from sort of the experts on the team to the new person. So they're good for training and onboarding. Third technique is one that we use very heavily at Shopify, which we use the term game days. It's not something we made up ourselves. I think it might have been Stripe who originally came out with a blog post on this. The idea here is that you start with a hypothesis about how the system will respond to a particular failure, and then you actually induce that real failure in production. It's quite important. Well, we find it quite important to actually do that in production. So turn off a database, turn off a network connection, and observe how the system responds to that. So this might seem counterintuitive, right? We're inducing a failure. We might be using up some of our error budget in doing this, but we find it extremely valuable to experience those failures in a very controlled environment where we know what's been broken, we have a team assembled, we can very quickly respond to it. We'd much rather have an incident occur in that environment than have it happen in the wild, where you have to assemble a team, you have to diagnose what happened, and it's always going to take much longer to solve that problem if it doesn't happen in that environment. So this is something that we use a lot. Each of our teams kind of run their own, and we find them very effective because we are learning new things every time we do it. We're learning about the behavior of the system today in that failure condition. Next technique, we use this metaphor internally of rusty knobs, and the idea here is if you have a software that is only used during incidents or during failure conditions, that software tends to get rusty if it's not used very much. So what we do is we have regular drills where we're using our mitigation software even if we're not in a failure situation. So here we're not breaking anything, we're just exercising mitigation. So we'll apply a throttle, remove it, fail over a system, fail it back, and that way we're exercising the software that we would be using. We find this extremely important so that we're building trust in the system, in that software, in those mitigations, that when we need them, they'll work because we've been testing them regularly and we have that confidence. The worst thing that can happen, right, is you haven't used this mitigation in months and months, and then suddenly you have a major incident and you try it and it doesn't work, right? I'm sure a lot of us have been in that situation. So regularly testing that software, that emergency software, is really important. one thing we've been doing the last couple of years is if there's an extreme weather event, such as a hurricane coming to one of our data centers, we'll actually do an evac of that data center because it is a good forcing function for doing a drill like that. It's a very time-boxed, usually only have a couple days notice, but it's enough time where you can assemble a team and do the drain in a very orderly fashion. And that discipline of always being ready to do that has really served us well. Like we've done one of those drills and then a week later had to do evacuation in anger, and because we did it the week before as a drill, we had confidence that it would work. So we find it extremely important. The fifth technique I'll talk about is automated failure testing or automated chaos testing. The idea here is there are certain classes of failures that tend to be fairly predictable, especially network degradation or interruption. If you have two systems that are connected via network, you can simulate degradation or interruption of that connection pretty easily in an isolated environment and run that in your CI so that you are testing those really common classes of failure conditions all the time continuously as you're developing your code. And this is really useful for sort of cutting out those really common classes of failures and making sure you catch them in CI before you even ship something in production, and validating that your system still behaves as it should in that failure condition. So there's lots of open source tools out there that help with this, so you often don't need to roll your own, and it can be quite easy to assemble unit tests that do these kind of scenarios. So I've gone through 5 different kinds of techniques, and one question you might be asking is, well, which of these is worth pursuing or exploring for my company? So one way, this is a fairly simplistic model, but one way of thinking about this is think about where the change is happening in your system or in your environment. So I want you to just take a second for this, take an immediate system that your team owns today and think about, where does it sit on a spectrum of how fast is the software changing? From a low, it's fairly stable, it hasn't been not getting a lot of change, to high, something new and it's under very active development, it's changing a lot. And then on the x-axis we have, how fast are the people involved in that system changing? Do we have a very stable, mature team, or do we have a fast-growing or a high turnover team where we have a lot of new people? So this spectrum kind of gives us an idea of where we need to focus our attention on practice and preparation. So I'm going to go clockwise from top left here. So if you have an environment where there's not a lot of turnover in the people, but the software is changing a lot, this is a time when game days are really effective for, that software has changed. We need to test the failures and make sure we understand the failure mode now. So that's really useful in that situation. If you're in a state of very high turnover, high growth in your people and in your software, I mean, honestly, in this situation, you're probably having enough real failures that you don't need to make up fake ones. So, learning from the failures you are having is probably the most effective thing to be doing in this situation, and having that transparent response where all those new people on the team can learn from that response and level up their skills as they go. So that's really important. The other technique that works really well when you're in that extreme growth mode is automated tests, because it really helps you get ahead of the curve of these failures, where you can sort of chop off classes of really common failures, catch them in CI, and then not have to worry about them in production. And that can really help you get ahead when you're in this kind of very, very high churn world. If you have software that's not changing very fast, but you have a lot of new team members, this is where, as I said, incident simulations or wheel of misfortunes are a great way of transferring knowledge between people, onboarding new people on the team. And then finally, if you're in a very static environment where things aren't changing very much, this is where that rusty knob turning or exercising the software that would only be used in emergency. If you haven't had that kind of emergency in a while, there's a good chance that software doesn't work and you need to be exercising it. So this is just one simple kind of model for thinking about which kind of incident practice or preparation techniques I might want to explore within your particular team. So, okay, I want to go a little bit deeper now. So if you think about it, all of those practices that I talked about are rooted in at least some idea of what kind of failure modes might be occurring, right? When you're doing simulations or game days or automated tests, you are starting from some basic understanding of what kind of failures can occur that you're building that simulation or test from. So what about those failures that are truly novel, like that kind of failure that you've never seen before? What kind of techniques can we use to help prepare for that? And what I'll argue, so of course because it's novel, by definition, you won't know exactly how to prepare for that. But what I'll argue is that what you can focus on is the characteristics of a team that is really effective at dealing with novel failures and thinking about what kind of team characteristics you want to build and focus on building up that team muscle so that the team is is in a good state to be able to respond to novel failures. So over the years, I've observed how different teams are able to respond to failures, and there's a few different characteristics that always stand out as a team that's really effective in these really novel failure situations. So a key part of this is having teams with a very high level of trust. You really need to be able to trust your colleagues that they're making the right judgment calls and you're sort of working together as a team and you have faith in each other. You have to be able to reach consensus really quickly and communicate very effectively. You also have to be willing to take risks, which is something that's very scary when you're in an incident situation. You have some failure that never happened before, probably means you probably have to, the solution for that is also going to be novel, and you're going to need to try something you've never tried before. And of course, you have to be very calculated about this, but you have to be willing to take risks in these situations, and you need to have a team that has that high level of trust and that high level of blamelessness where they're willing to take risks and they know that they're all in it together in solving it. So that's really important. And also creativity, thinking outside the box, thinking of novel solutions to a problem is something that the team has to be able to do in these situations. And then finally, one that I think is really important is the team has to have a lot of empathy. So you have to have empathy for each other in the situation, for other people who might be involved, and also for the downstream customers who are impacted by that. So if every action you take in responding to a novel failure, you're thinking about who is impacted by this and having empathy for them, it really helps guide you in the right direction in your response. So the question is, so if we know what kind of characteristics of a team that are really effective at these novel failures, how can we help sort of build up this muscle within our team? So we've been running a lot of different exercises within our team at Shopify to try to build up these skills and build up these high-strength teams. And I have a little bit of a recipe for how to design an exercise where you can work on these characteristics. So what you want to do is you want to build an exercise where there's a very clear, very intuitive end goal. So in an incident, you always know what done looks like, right? You know what it looks like to have succeeded. But there's very few other rules or constraints. So you want to have a clear goal, but very unclear path of how to get there. And ideally, you want to have a few twists and turns along the way where you're adding new information or you're forcing the team to make pivots as they're solving a problem. You want to be able to, I find it really important to randomize your teams when you do these exercises so that people are working together with others that they don't normally work with. This often happens in an incident, right? Whoever happens to be on call across the company ends up coming together, and you might not have worked with them before. And being, number one, being in a comfortable environment where you can work with new people, but also building up those connections across the organization where you get to know each other and start to build that level of trust. You can do this through these exercises. And finally, I think it's really important to have fun while you're at it. Incidents are very stressful, so you might as well have a little bit of fun when you're doing training exercises. So we've tried a lot of different kinds of exercises. One that we've hit on that we found really effective, 5 minutes, is exercises involving Lego. So with Lego, you know what done looks like, right? You know what a built Lego set looks like, but you can throw lots of twists and turns in how to get there. So I don't have enough time to go into a lot of details. So what I've done is I've created a GitHub repo. I'll share a link at the end with a lot of detailed notes about these exercises. But just to give you a quick flavor for them, one simple one we've done is, you take I think we took like 10 very large Lego sets, had a big group together, take all the bags out of the boxes and just scramble them all together, throw away the instructions, and then say, everyone go grab a bag, figure out what set it's part of, and then go figure it out. So this is very simple to organize and do. And we did one like this, and it was a great, the team had a great deal of fun, and they really built a lot of that strength in responding to an incident. And one sign of success is that it was a scene of sheer pandemonium at the beginning. So this is a sign of, you're having a good, successful incident simulation when everyone's in a panic. But seeing highly trained professionals in a panic over Lego is just a joy to watch. So I'd highly recommend trying something like this. And of course, you have fun along the way. And then hopefully by the end you end up in this kind of state where you have a team that's working together. This team has built an assembly line. They've got some buckets. They've looked up online and found the instructions, and they're working together as a team, and they're solving that problem. And they're getting to know each other along the way, and they're sort of getting used to what it's like to be in this kind of somewhat high pressure, but also a little bit fun at the same time. So I highly recommend. Again, I'll share a link at the end that kind of goes through a lot more detail. I'd really encourage you to be creative, though, and come up with your own ideas to do these kind of exercises and sort of build up these team muscles that are really valuable during incidents. So to sum up quickly, if you're a successful SRE team, you will see this continual drift towards more and more novelty in your failures. There are lots of well-known practices that are available for helping you learn and prepare. You really have to think about, you need to prepare the people, the teams, and the systems to be able to respond to these kind of failure situations. And I think it's really important to not overlook the importance of building up a very strong team, where you have a very strong culture within the team with a high level of trust and creativity and problem solving. So that brings me to the end. So there's a link there to some of the scenarios. I'm also going to be sharing the slides, so you'll be able to find it. So I hope that's useful to you. But again, I highly encourage you to make up your own kind of scenarios and be really creative and put your team under pressure in a way that's also a little bit fun, and they're learning together. So thank you very much for your time, and that's it. Sure.
Should we do a short Q&A?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we're going to do a short Q&A. We've got time for maybe 2-3 questions. Hands up if you've got a question. Oh, question over here.
Hello, good talk. How do you achieve the full transparency in the incident communication channels?
Right, so I didn't want to get into it because it might be a little bit too specific for our company. What we do is we're very Slack-based. So we have all of our incident mitigation tools are all run by chat bots within Slack, and all of our data information is shared within a channel in Slack. And we record We record that information to be saved later, but it's also available. It's in a public channel that anyone can get to if they need to, and we share it that way. So again, it depends on what kind of communication channels your company uses. You'd have to think about how to apply it in your organization differently.
Thank you very much. Question over here.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. And how do you tell the business how often did your game days go wrong, and how did you explain to the business that your customers lost a lot of money, just because of our training went awry?
Yes, it does happen. I remember one where we'd had a major incident, we fixed it, and then the game day to prove that it was fixed caused the same outage to occur again. That's obviously a worst case scenario. Really the main argument is, how would you like to see this failure? Would you like to see it happen when there's a team assembled and ready and they know what failed? Or would you like to happen on a Saturday night when everyone's off and you're going to need another 10, 15 minutes to assemble a team and diagnose what's wrong before you could even get to solving the problem? So the argument is, we're sort of pre-failing. We're pulling the incident forward in time, and we're going to have it now while we're ready for it, instead of having it in the future. So we're not adding a new failure. We're just moving a failure up. Is really the simple argument, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about the transparency during security incidents. Do you offer the same kind of transparency during incidents where there's need to know information only, or how do you handle training for those things?
Yeah, so that is different. So during a security incident, one of our first steps is making that determination as if it is something that's sensitive and we cannot have in public, and then we do use a private channel for that. So certainly there are kinds of incidents where for legal reasons or whatever, you can't share that. So we try to keep those to a minimum, but they certainly do happen. So yeah, good question.
Brilliant. I'm sorry, we're out of time for questions now. We're going to move on to the next talk. So a round of applause again for John. That was fantastic.